The ocean. Anyone who has ever stared into its endless, primordial blue horizon knows that it's mesmerizing, a kind of quiet awe that borders on something older than words. It's been with us since the very beginning, older than our cities, our languages, even our religions. And for just as long, we have told stories about it. Some echoed about the conquests of kings that are long forgotten now, others of explorers chasing fortune, brave captains and new lands waiting beyond the horizon. But there are darker stories too. The ones sailors only whispered when the moon was bright and the waves were quiet. Stories of the sea's other side, of ships that sail forever, of crews that can never return home, of haunted glows appearing on open water. This is the myth of ghost ships, especially the Flying Dutchman. I have been obsessed with it ever since I watched Pirates of the Caribbean. Let's start by first defining what ghost ships are. A ghost ship, or a phantom ship, is any vessel without a living crew on board. It can be a legendary vessel, like the Flying Dutchman, or a real abandoned ship with its crew missing or dead, such as the Mary Celeste. The image we see when we hear the word ghost ship is usually based on the story of the Flying Dutchman, a wooden hull ship with iron fittings, heavy-duty canvas sails, 3 masts, and the typical look of 17th, 18th century merchant vessels. While this video is centered around exactly this ship, the queen of phantom vessels, I want to mention that tales of ghostly boats exist worldwide. It's a universal part of folklore. What is interesting is how every culture, no matter how far from Europe, tells its own version of a vessel that shouldn't exist. So let's leave the ocean for a moment and head deep into the Canadian forests. So, why the Flying Dutchman has come to define the archetype, the tall-masted, storm-bound spectre from the golden age of seafaring, not all ghost vessels look like this. In fact, some are far smaller. These stories appear wherever people travel across water. In Quebec, there's a tale of the Chasse-Galerie, or the flying canoe, a bewitched canoe set to fly through the night sky itself after its lumberjack passengers made a deal with the devil. In some versions, the devil himself is steering the canoe and deliberately tries to break the rules they agreed on, so the lumberjacks drove him out to save themselves. But on the other hand, the best-known version, written by Honor Beaugrand, who was, by the way, the mayor of Montreal before he wrote the story, Lucifer is said to be quite nice. Like, okay, whatever, like the devil is nice, etc. Another ghost ship story takes us near southern Chile's Chiloé archipelago. Locals tell the tale of the El Caleuche, an illuminated ship that rises from the sea at night, glowing and filled with music. A phantom vessel that is said to be crewed by witches and demons who kidnap young women and raid the shores of Chile. There are many versions of this myth. In some, the ship's crew can transform into seals, sea lions, or dolphins to avoid being seen by mortals. In other common version, the ship is actually not evil, just simply a party ship of warlocks who like to rent out merchants' daughters in exchange for merchandise to party with them. Quite an interesting interpretation of a ghost ship story. Not all ghost ships bring music and mischief. Some bring fire, curses, warning. And a few are as dramatic as the next one. On the freezing coasts of Canada, witnesses speak of the Baie fire ship, a burning ship's ghostly silhouette that is seen drifting across the water, appearing and vanishing just like the ghosts of the land, if they exist at all. It's been said to appear as a flaming, three-mast galley, and local accounts claim that we can hear the screams of the burning ship passengers by submerging our feet into the shallow bay waters. Versions of the origin tale include a group of pirates killing a woman who casts a curse on the crew with her dying words, condemning them to burn forever. Like, who doesn't love a good revenge story? And ghost ships aren't just a European or North American thing. Even cultures half a world away with completely different worldviews tell tales of same kind of spectral vessels. One of the most haunting ones comes from New Zealand. And in New Zealand, there is the phantom Waka, The legend goes like this. In 1886, a boat full of tourists on Lake Tarawera, New Zealand, saw what appeared to be a Waka approaching their boat, only to disappear in the mist half a mile from them. One of the witnesses was a local Maori clergyman, a man of God. Nobody around the lake owned such a war canoe, and nothing like it had been seen on the lake for many years. A number of letters have been published by the frightened tourists who experienced the event, so they believed that they saw something frightening. Though skeptics maintained that it was only an eerie reflection seen on the mist, Maori tribal elders claimed it was a Waka Voirua, I hope the pronunciation is on point, a spirit canoe, and was an omen of impending doom. 11 days later, Mount Tarawera erupted, claiming more than 150 lives. And what's fascinating is that the deeper we look, the more we realize these stories aren't random. They show patterns, recurring shapes that travel across cultures. And these myths I have mentioned are only the tip of the iceberg of phantom ship lore, but not of that iceberg that sank the Titanic. That's for another video. Ghost ships are not one myth, but many, echoes shaped by geography, belief, and the human relationship with water itself. Because ghost ships aren't really about ships. I know it sounds funny. They are reflections of the people who see them, shaped by geography, belief, and whatever dangers their world was full of. Now, let's get to the part we have all been waiting for since I started yapping about cursed canoes. The flagship, pun intended, of phantom vessels, the Flying Dutchman. This legend rises above the rest, the one that every sailor, every novelist, and every filmmaker ends up circling back to. It's safe to say that she is the single most well-known ghost ship in the world, with sightings dating back to the late 1700s, like the same era my posters are from, when it was referenced in a book that has the not-so-short title of Travels in Various Parts of Europe, Asia, Africa during a series of 30 years and upward, written by John MacDonald, like the good old 18th century book titles, who, as the name of his book suggests, traveled a lot on the seven seas. The quote goes like this. The weather was so stormy that the sailors said they saw the Flying Dutchman. The common story is that this Dutchman came to the Cape in distress of weather and wanted to get into harbor, but could not get a pilot to conduct her and was lost, and that ever since in very bad weather, her vision appears. Only a few years later, in 1795, another author, George Barrington, retold the story in his book, A Voyage to New South Wales. His version added details that stuck around. Let me read you part of his original account. I had often heard of the superstition of sailors respecting apparitions and doom, but had never given much credit to the report. It seems that some years since a Dutchman of war was lost off the Cape of Good Hope and every soul on board perished. Her consort weathered the gale and arrived soon after at the Cape. Having refitted and returning to Europe, they were assailed by a violent tempest, nearly in the same latitude. In the night watch, some of the people saw, or imagined they saw, a vessel standing for them under a press of sail, as though she would run them down. One in particular affirmed it was the ship that had foundered in the former gale, and that it must certainly be her, or the apparition of her, but on its clearing up, the object, a dark thick cloud, disappeared. Nothing could do away the idea of this phenomenon in the minds of the sailors, and, on their relating the circumstances when they arrived in port, the story spread like wildfire, and the supposed phantom was called the Flying Dutchman. From the Dutch, the English seamen got the infatuation, and there are very few Indian men, but what has some on board who pretends to have seen the apparition. And that was it. The myth was alive. Sailors across Europe began repeating the tale, claiming they had seen the phantom ship. And because sailors travel, story traveled with them, from porn towers to naval academies to merchant fleets to whaling crews. Then the story evolved again and again. Another early 19th century version comes from the Scottish scholar John Lydon himself, who recorded a different interpretation of the legend. Check this out. In his account, the Flying Dutchman and its crew are doomed not simply because they perished in a storm or misfortune, but because of a terrible crime. He writes that sailors believed a ghostly ship would appear off the southern coast of Africa before violent storms. This phantom vessel, the Flying Dutchman, was said to be crewed by sailors who had committed some unspeakable wrongdoing in the early days of seafaring. As a punishment, they were struck by a deadly plague and condemned to roam the ocean forever, unable to rest, until their long period of penance finally ends. As we have seen, throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, the Flying Dutchman was reportedly sighted many times. But the moment that truly cemented the Flying Dutchman in public imagination wasn't a folktale or a soulless rumor. It was an event witnessed by royalty. In 1881, Prince George of Wales, the future King George V, grandfather of Queen Elizabeth II, who just died recently, was on a long naval voyage with his brother, Prince Albert Victor. During this journey, something truly eerie was recorded. Their own ship, the Bacchant, had suffered radar damage, so the princes temporarily transferred to another vessel, HMS Inconstant. And according to the ship's log, in the early hours of July 11th, off the coast of Australia, the crew witnessed something terrifying. The log describes a glowing red light cutting across the bow. Inside that blood-red glow, a full shape of a phantom ship appeared. Masts, sails, every detail clearly visible, only about 200 yards away. Multiple crew members saw it, the officer on duty, a midshipman, sailors on deck, 13 witnesses in total. But when one of the naval cadets ran forward to the front of the ship for a closer look, the ship vanished completely. No hull, no sails, nothing, despite the clear weather and calm sea. And strangely, later that same morning, the sailor who had first reported the apparition fell from the mast and died instantly. We can say that if this had been the claim of one drunk seaman, the story would have died in a tavern. But it was different. These were future kings and admirals, men whose words carried weight. Respected men with reputations to protect, not embellish. By recording the incident, they risked ridicule, yet they documented it anyway, suggesting that they genuinely believed what they saw. And this is where folktale and reality start blending, not because ghost ships were proven real, but because people across enough ranks believed they had seen one. This very report of the famous phantom vessel has transformed the legend from a tale of drunk pirates and seamen into a semi-accepted fact of maritime subculture. Ghost ships do exist. The myth of the cursed watercraft went mainstream. It spread to the utmost layers of society. Legends can haunt sailors, but reality can haunt history and us. And some of the most chilling sea stories didn't come from imagination. They came from ship logbooks. And that's where myth ends and the horror of reality begins. As the legend of the Flying Dutchman is only half the story. Because while this phantom vessel may belong to myth, the oceans hold something far more disturbing. Real ghost ships, not centuries-old tales, but actual vessels found drifting without a single living soul on board. Some carrying food that is still warm, others carrying only silence, and in the worst cases, corpses. And perhaps the most infamous case of that all is the Mary Celeste. On December the 5th, 1872, a Canadian brigantine named Da Gracia was sailing through the choppy waters between Portugal and the Azores when its crew noticed something strange. Another ship slowly rocking in the waves, no signals, no crew on deck. Nothing but eerie stillness. It was the Mary Celeste. When the sailors boarded the ship, they found the scene straight out of a horror film, but not the kind film with blood and bodies, not Terrifier. This was far worse. The ship was too normal, too intact. The cargo was untouched. The crew's personal belongings were still in their cabins. Food and supplies were plentiful, fresh water abundant. Even the captain's pipe, something no captain would willingly leave behind, was resting where it had always been. But the people vanished. 10 souls, including Captain Benjamin Briggs, his wife, and their 2-year-old daughter Sophia, gone without a trace. And the most haunting detail: there were no signs of violence, no struggle, no storm damage, no leak big enough to justify abandoning the ship. As if it was, everyone simply stood up, walked calmly to the lifeboat, and disappeared into the Atlantic. For the last 150 years, theories have ranged from scientific to the absurd. A sudden water sprout, an explosion of alcohol fumes from the cargo, piracy, mutiny, or even paranormal intervention, of course. But none of them perfectly explain why. Why would an experienced captain take his family and crew off a perfectly seaworthy vessel in the middle of the ocean? The Mary Celeste remains the gold standard of real-life ghost ships. A mystery so chilling that it feels fictional, even though every word of it is historically documented. But the Mary Celeste is only the beginning, because the ocean's most terrifying stories aren't always dramatic. Sometimes they are quiet. Sometimes the ship simply sails out and never returns. Our next case takes us far into the Southern Ocean, a part of the world so violent and remote that even today ships disappear without leaving a single trace behind. And among those tragedies, one story stands out: the vanishing of the Marlborough, an iron-built merchant ship that left New Zealand in January 1890 and simply never arrived. The Marlborough was no amateur vessel. She had crossed the world for over a decade, carrying immigrants to New Zealand and returning to Britain with wool and frozen meat. She survived storms, ice, the brutal winds of Cape Horn, the usual nightmares of 19th century sailing. But on January 11, 1890, she set out from Lyttelton, New Zealand, on what would have been another routine voyage home. 2 days later, another ship spotted her. Everything seemed fine. That would be the last confirmed sighting of the Marlborough, ever. Weeks passed, then months, then years. Nothing. No wreckage, no messages, no bodies. Lloyds eventually declared her missing, and the world assumed she had been crushed by the enormous icebergs that haunt those waters. But then, the stories began, of course. Decades later, newspapers reported that a derelict ship had been found near Cape Horn, perfectly preserved in a lonely cove. By the way, a cove is a smaller bay, for those who are not sailors. Its masts green with decay. When a boarding party went inside, they discovered skeletons. The crew frozen in place as if the Marlborough had sailed straight out of time. A captain's body near the wheel. Sailors collapsed in the mess room. All of them long dead. The ship, according to the story, was unmistakable. Marlborough heading to Glasgow. It is the kind of tale that sounds too cinematic to be real, and it probably is. Investigations later showed major inconsistencies. Wrong locations, wrong ships, witnesses that never existed. The whole report was almost certainly a mix of rumor, myth, and mistaken identity. Basically, 19th century fake news with some sprinkle of ghost stories. But the legend stuck, because unlike its discovery, the Marlborough was real, her disappearance was real, and the fact remains. A 70-meter steel ship with 30 souls on board sailed into the Southern Ocean and never came back. No wreck ever found, nobody recovered, no final message. Just a ghost ship story that refuses to die, and a mystery that is still with us. But ghost ships aren't just legends trapped in the past. They are not all spectral vessels glowing on the horizon or ships disappearing into fog and never returning. Some ghost ship stories are painfully real, modern, physical reminders of what happens when a crew vanishes and only the vessel survives. And unlike Marlborough, these cases leave behind more than mystery, they leave behind bodies. Every winter, a grim pattern repeats itself along Japan's northern coastline. Derelict wooden boats drifting ashore, often with the skeletal remains of their North Korean crews. These vessels, now widely known as North Korean ghost ships, are the result of a dangerous mix of geopolitical pressure, illegal overfishing, and sheer desperation. North Korean fishermen are pushed farther and farther out into the open waters because large Chinese dark fleet trawlers, operating illegally in North Korean territory, have depleted local squid stocks by nearly 70% according to reports. With outdated engines, no GPS and very little food, many of these North Korean boats never make it home. Some are manned by soldiers, others by civilians renting military ships, but the fate is often the same: exposure, starvation, and drifting until seasonal winds carry them to Japan. Japanese authorities then cremate the bodies, dismantle the boats, and record the incidents. In 2017 alone, over 100 vessels were found. Analysts claim that these are not defectors or spies, but victims of a collapsing fishing industry and deadly risk at sea. What washes ashore is no myth. It's a real-life ghost ship. A ship found with its dead crew. By now, you can probably see a pattern emerging. A ship sets out to the sea, something strange or catastrophic occurs, and later it is found drifting, silent, empty, or crewed only by the dead. Sometimes, witnesses claim to see ghostly apparitions on the horizon, pale lights through the fog, or ships that vanish as quickly as they appear. This recurring basis forms the blueprint for ghost ship legends. So let's take a closer look at how this trope is developed, why it is still alive, and what might lie behind these eerie explanations or eerie stories. First, the Chasse-Galerie's tale is literally about a cursed flying canoe full of French-Canadian lumberjacks. Across Europe, Germany, Celtic, Slavic, there's a recurring myth called the White Hunt, a ghostly, supernatural hunt flying across the night sky, led by a powerful mythological figure, often Odin, but sometimes devils, cursed kings, fallen souls, etc. These myths all have a recurring theme: nocturnal flight, supernatural chases, punishment for sin or for breaking taboos, danger to anyone who sees it, the souls of the dead or cursed mortals and companions. This becomes a template for countless later legends. Before this story, Chasse-Galerie, reached Canada, French already had a version directly modern on the White Hunt. The legend describes Lord Gallery, a nobleman who loved hunting so much that he skipped Sunday Mass. Skipping Sunday Mass back then was a serious offense because it signaled that you don't give a damn about religious authority. At a time when attending church was seen as a mandatory public duty. As a punishment, he was condemned to fly eternally through the night sky, pursued by ghostly animals in the exact same style as the White Hunt. So, the Chasse-Galerie didn't come from nowhere, it came from a French reinterpretation of the White Hunt mythology. Then, French settlers brought this legend with them. In Canada, they encountered indigenous First Nation stories about flying canoes, spirit travel, and night journeys. Folklore merged and gave us the flying canoe, the Devil's Pact, the journey through the night sky, the threat of being carried away forever if the rules were broken. This mixture produced a new world version of the White Hunt, but now adapted to the French-Canadian cultural symbols, French-speaking lumberjacks, and the North American wilderness. So the Chasse-Galerie is basically White Hunt structure, French Christian context, and First Nations flying canoe lore. This pattern, an old myth merging with local beliefs, is more common than we first think. Now let's travel to South America to debunk the Caleuche myth. Some researchers have tried to explain the glowing phantom party ship of Caleuche without turning to the supernatural. One idea suggests that the so-called luminous vessel was actually a natural light phenomenon. For example, bioluminescent seawater caused by tiny glowing organisms such as Noctulica scintilans, I hope it pronounced it right, a microscopic plankton species that make the ocean shine bright blue at night when waves or movement disturb it. I mean, these pictures look straight out of James Cameron's Avatar, so it's kind of easy to understand why people back then thought that this stuff is not from the realm of the living. It can create large patches of glowing water, which from a distance might easily look like a mysterious glowing ship drifting in the dark. Others argue that the whole thing might fall under the category of OSNIs or OFNIs, unidentified, submerged, or floating objects. Uncanny sights at sea sailors can't immediately identify but aren't necessarily paranormal. When it comes to the origins of the legend, some historians believe Caleuche might just be a reimagined version of the classic European ghost ship myth, the Flying Dutchman, our best friend, brought over and reshaped in Chilean folklore. Another theory ties it to the real vessel, a Dutch ship Caleuche, captained by Vincent van Ucht, which disappeared here in the early 1600s. But the most granted explanation is simple. The story may have been invented by shady locals to disguise smuggling routes around the Chile archipelago. I mean, anyone who has watched Scooby-Doo knows the easiest way to hide your shady business is just to make a bunch of ghost stories, right? In other words, Caleuche might not be a curse ship at all, just a blend of natural ocean phenomena, old European myths, and a bit of strategic storytelling. And once we see how Caleuche mixes natural phenomena with folklore, the next story becomes even more obvious. The fireship of Baie de Chaleurs can be debunked by roughly the same explanations. When we dig into the myth, you start to notice a pattern. The more dramatic the legend, usually the more mundane the explanation is. Researchers have been trying to figure out this glowing ghost ship for more than a century, and their conclusions line up almost perfectly with each other. Dr. J. Orn Green from Harvard looked into it and argued that the whole thing was electrical in nature, some kind of rare atmospheric phenomenon. Professor William Francis Genong, who actually visited the region, went even further. He believed the fireship was nothing more than just St. Elmo's fire, a known plasma-like glow that dances on ship's masts during certain weather conditions. No, not that Elmo. And G.L. Ellis, a geologist from Cambridge, suggested it might simply be a marsh gas patch shifting over the water, something that can ignite or glow under the right conditions. These explanations, electrical effects, bioluminescence, gas, may not be as romantic as the legends, but they do fit with what these witnesses describe: a floating light with no solid form, appearing and disappearing randomly. And it's important because the supernatural stories that groove around the phenomenon are intense. One tale speaks of a Portuguese slaver whose ship supposedly burned after he was killed by the Mi'kmaq people, and whose ghost, along with the spirits of the dead crew, now haunts the bay for 1,000 years. Another version blames a group of pirates cursed by a dying woman whose last words condemned them to burn on the water forever. The one that I mentioned earlier. A third one tells of a murdered sailor whose cat blood returned for vengeance as a blazing specter. These legends show common folklore tropes: haunting of those who passed away violently and punishment for evil deeds. They are folklore built around the mystery that people didn't have the science to explain yet. So, despite the ghostly glow, the phantom flames, and the centuries of terrifying tales, the fireship of Baie de Chaleurs isn't a supernatural revenge story at all. It's a natural phenomenon, one that early witnesses tried to explain the only way they could, through the supernatural. But what about the phantom Waka, you might ask? After all, multiple people have seen it. Yes, that's right. They saw something, but it wasn't a ghost Waka. Most likely the rise and fall of the lake level, caused by the pre-eruption fissures, had freed the burial Waka from its resting place. Traditionally, such Waka burials, the dead were tied in an upright position, so what the witnesses described wasn't a supernatural omen, but a real burial canoe that had been broken free from its resting place, carrying its dead masters. A bit nasty, but there are no spirits, no prophecy, no phantom passengers. Just geology, rising water, and a sacred artifact momentarily put back into the world of the living by the upcoming volcanic eruption. But if we are talking ghost ships, we can't ignore the heavyweight champion of maritime legends, Flying Dutchman. Now let's call her out. Let's look at its name first. When we hear the name the Flying Dutchman, one question often comes up. Why Dutch? Why not British, Spanish or Portuguese, powers that also rule the seas? Well, in the 17th and 18th centuries, the answer would have been more obvious. The Dutch weren't just sailors back then, they were the naval powerhouse of the planet. Their trading company, the VOC, basically an empire, the Dutch East India Company, was basically a global superpower disguised as a corporation. At its peak, the VOC was richer than Apple, Google, and the Saudi Arabia Oil Company today combined. They had armies, built fortresses, controlled entire trade routes, and sent out fleets that circled the world non-stop. And with their ships constantly pushing through the most dangerous waters on the planet, the Cape of Good Hope, the Indian Ocean, the South Pacific, it makes perfect sense that sailor legends would attach themselves to the Dutch, the nation whose vessels were everywhere virtually. If you were a sailor in the 16 or 1800s, odds are the ghost story that you heard around the lantern wasn't Spanish, French or English, it was Dutch. Because in their era of dominance, their ships spanned the globe and their captains pushed through the deadliest waters sailors knew. So the legend stuck. A phantom ship crewed by sailors from the world's most powerful maritime empire, cursed to sail forever. Now, let's take a closer look at John Leyden's version of the Flying Dutchman, where the crew supposedly committed some horrible crime and were cursed to wander the oceans forever. Sounds creepy. Sure. But once we look at this Leyden guy himself, the whole story starts to make a lot more sense. Leyden was a Scottish scholar born in a tiny village as a son of a shepherd who somehow managed to send him to Edinburgh University to study theology. He was supposed to become a minister, but in reality he ended up becoming a poet and folklorist. And yet those early religious expectations still shaped his worldview. So, when Leyden recorded the Flying Dutchman story in the early 19th century, he framed it like a moral tale to keep sailors at bay. A kind of flowing cautionary sermon. In his version, the ghost ship wasn't just lost in a storm or cursed by bad luck. No, its crew had committed some unspeakable wrongdoing and was struck by a deadly plague as a divine punishment and were forced to sail for eternity until their penance was complete. It's dramatic, it's moralistic. It's exactly the kind of interpretation you would expect from someone who was raised inside a strict religious framework. Even if he didn't fully believe it himself, Leyden didn't record a neutral ghost story. He interpreted it through the lens of sin, punishment, and redemption, because that was the narrative structure he grew up with. In other words, his version tells us more about him and the era's obsession of moral judgment than of any ghost ship. But yeah, I know what you have been waiting for. How can anyone possibly debunk the 1881 royal sighting? Well, here's the thing. They did see something, that's for certain. But as when you have royalty, future leaders of the British Empire, plus a dozen trained sailors all reporting the same ghost ship, we can safely rule out lies, sailors' yarns, or drunken hallucination. Something appeared on the horizon that convicted all of them that they had witnessed the infamous Flying Dutchman. So the question isn't whether they saw something, it's what they actually saw. And the most likely explanation is something a lot less supernatural and a lot more scientific. Fata Morgana. This is an extremely complex type of mirage that appears just above the horizon, caused by layers of warm and cold air bending light like a lens. When this happens, distant ships can stretch, invert, stack on top of themselves, or glow in strange ways. In calm weather, exactly like the night of the 1881 sighting, a thermal inversion can create an atmospheric duct that produces these bizarre, rapidly shifting illusions. Sailors have described Fata Morganas as floating castles, upside-down coastlines, even ships that appear transparent or on fire. It's the perfect recipe for a phantom vessel. Of course, it could have also been St. Elmo's fire, that eerie blue or red electrical glow that forms on masts rigging during atmospheric disturbances. Combine that with a distant ship distorted by the way of light blends, and you suddenly get exactly what the Bacan's crew describe: glowing red shape with visible masts and sails. And as for the sailor who died a few hours later, there's nothing supernatural about that. Failing from the rigging was a common cause of death at sea. It wasn't a curse or a punishment for being the first mortal to see the Dutchman, just a tragic accident in an era when climbing a wet mast in the dark was part of the job. So yes, 1881 sighting did happen. The witnesses were credible, but what they saw was almost certainly a real ship distorted by extreme atmospheric light effects, not a cursed vessel doomed to sail forever. Here's the funny part. The princes didn't identify the apparition as a ghost ship. They identified it as the Flying Dutchman. Why? I personally think it's because as the ghost ship story they grew up with was the Flying Dutchman. In the Anglosphere, the Dutchman was the most famous maritime legend of them all. So when they saw something strange on the horizon, their brains didn't reach for Caleuche or the Baie de Chaleurs fire ship. They reached for the legend they already knew. Because at the end of the day, people don't just see things, they interpret them. Just like a Tibetan sees an ape-like creature, we say it's the Yeti, while someone from the Pacific Northwest says it's Bigfoot. It's basically your culture determining what you see. As science progressed, ghost ship sightings get more and more rare. However, the cultural heritage of ghost ships is undeniably rich, and we talk about them even in the 21st century. Look at Pirates of the Caribbean, Scooby-Doo, or SpongeBob. Ghost ships didn't survive into the modern pop culture, they thrived. The trope became one of those pieces of folklore that refuses to die, constantly reinventing itself. From movies to pulp novels and video games, the ghost ship remains instantly recognizable. It's a perfect blend of adventure, fear, and mystery. Ghost ship stories survive, unlike their crew, because every culture has one, and every era reshapes the fear behind it. Sailors solve curses, Victorians solve morality tales, and we see eerie vibes and deep-sea mystery. The ocean still hides more than we understand, so the trope feels just as alive today, even if science has taken the ghosts out of most ships. If you like this yapping about folklore, history, and myths, then hit the like button, subscribe, and ring the bell so you won't miss my next video. Thank you for watching, and Daniel out!